Thank you very much, Claude. Good to talk about this this topic, and inspired particularly by the report that we published at Orkestra just was 3 or 4 weeks ago now. Every year we produce a Basque Country competitiveness report, and this year's analysis has been particularly challenging because well, our plans at the beginning of the year for what the report was going to be about obviously changed radically as the year went on and kept on changing. So the final result has been a report that sought to try and understand this concept of regional resilience. And I think it's got messages that go well beyond the Basque Country, and hopefully will be an interesting discussion, provide an interesting discussion in the Irish context this morning, in the context of the pandemic, but also in the context of other shocks such as the Brexit discussions that are obviously very present at the moment. And seeing the news this morning, getting increasingly tricky. So the title is Resilience Before, During and After the Pandemic. And I just wanted to start by talking a little bit about that concept of resilience. When we started working on the report, kind of in April, May, we realized, we were going to have to change quite radically what we were thinking of doing for this year's Basque Country competitive report. And very quickly, the concept turned to resilience. I think is the type of concept that everyone's been very concerned with since the start of the pandemic. How do we do things that make our economies resilient to these types of shocks, both in the short term and also in the long term? And so we thought we would frame the report in terms of this concept of resilience, and we started to look into it in more detail. And of course, the word resilience, although very topical, very trendy, is also perhaps a little bit misunderstood. It has different types of meanings, and so we look back, of course, the origins in the Latin resilire, to regress or to bounce back. But when we look at the academic literature on resilience, we see that actually there are different interpretations or different perspectives on what the concept of resilience might mean in a territorial context. The kind of basic engineering concept is this notion of bouncing back, the ability of a system to return to a pre-disturbance equilibrium. So you have a shock from an equilibrium and then you go back towards the equilibrium. But there's also a kind of more ecological perception or perspective on resilience, which talks about the ability of the system to persist in the face of change. So change may be more continuous, and we have a kind of this movement to new equilibria in a more continuous way, a kind of what might be called bouncing forward. And there's been a lot of discussion and kind of popular debate about, in the context of the pandemic, about bouncing back better or bouncing forward, etc. But the perspective that we found most relevant for framing our challenges in the Basque Country was the evolutionist perspective, or evolutionary perspective. And this frames resilience really as more of an intrinsic capacity or capability of a system, its ability to continually change, adapt and transform. So this notion of renovating or transforming. And that was the frame we decided to give to this year's Basque Competitiveness Report, above all because while COVID is clearly a big disruptive force that's shaping how we understand economic development in a huge way this year, we shouldn't forget that there are other underlying changes, transformations to do with particularly the climate emergency and the green transition, digital transitions, other kind of socio-demographic transitions that predate COVID and will post-date COVID. So this notion of what we do in response to COVID should also take into account these underlying structural changes that are taking place. So we thought that this evolutionary perspective of how we analyze our capacity as a region to continually adapt and transform was the most appropriate framing of resilience for the report. We then took that and we decided to, building on that evolutionary perspective, that we needed to understand resilience as a really long-term concept. And that meant looking at the Basque economy before the pandemic, trying to understand where it was, what its fundamentals were in terms of competitiveness. Also looking at it during the pandemic, what was happening now. That was the most difficult bit, of course, because data is not always available or up to date, but we wanted to try and understand, well, how was the region, its firms, its government responding this year? And then perhaps most importantly, we wanted to reflect on what should the Basque Country do to ensure long-term resilience after the pandemic? So we kind of gave it this three-pronged focus. First of all, looking back, and we used the data that was available from 2019 in a whole range of indicators, about 50 different competitive indicators, to look at where the Basque Country was and benchmark it to other European regions. We then looked in particularly at the responses of firms and policy during the pandemic. So we interviewed quite a lot of businesses to understand their responses, and particularly regarding digitalization. And we conducted a kind of comparative analysis with two other regions that are quite similar to the Basque Country, Baden-Württemberg and Upper Austria, in terms of their industrial structure, to look and see what the policy responses were like. And then I think perhaps most interestingly, and where I want to focus today more, is we looked at what can this tell us about the keys to ensuring long-term resilience after the pandemic. And there we brought in a whole range of research that we've been doing in other projects, including some work on clusters, which I also want to try and share today, given that this is very much a cluster community. So I won't talk about the before part, the big diagnostic analysis. If you're interested, then the report's online, and the first part of the report is dedicated to that benchmarking analysis, but it's not so interesting to understand where the Basque Country is in terms of its competitiveness, I think. But I will focus briefly on the during, and then more importantly on the after. So in terms of the during, if we look at the economic impact of the pandemic, again, here you have data up to August. The report was published in November, and that was the latest data we could get. But there's probably now some more recent data available. But we can see the dramatic fall in the industrial production index. You see the Basque Country is the green line there. So it's actually significantly worse hit in terms of its industrial production than the EU average, and even the Spanish average. That's in part because Spain was worse hit during the pandemic in its first wave, and it also in part because industry is a bigger proportion of Basque GDP than it is in most other regions in Spain or indeed in Europe. Also, similar statistics with regards exports, a big reduction in international trade. We know about an unprecedented fall in GDP, and a significant impact employment, as again within most places in terms of employees being furloughed and different schemes being brought in to try and protect individuals, but a big fall in employment. And above all, I think the economic impact of the pandemic created big challenges for business and policy decision making because of the great uncertainty. There was uncertainty around how the pandemic was going to evolve. There still is. Uncertainty around the containment measures. Again, there still is, which makes policy decision making both at the government level and at the business level extremely difficult and challenging. And I think that was the kind of the context we were looking at in terms of during the pandemic. So three things to point out, I think, in terms of what we concluded by looking at how the Basque Country was resisting the pandemic or responding to it. On the one hand, quite vastly asymmetric impacts across sectors. Again, probably to be expected, and this is something that we probably also see with other shocks, such as the Brexit, such as the impacts that Brexit might have. We analysed the severity of impacts across different sectors. We looked at their likely recovery trajectories, and we also looked at the financial health of firms in different sectors. And through that kind of three factors, we were able to identify especially at-risk sectors. You can see in the graph there the vast divergence in terms of the production of sectors over this year. But what we discovered, perhaps not surprisingly, was that local sectors such as hospitality and retail were in the highest risk category, as were sectors related to social activities such as leisure and culture. But perhaps most significantly from the Basque economy, there were very important sectors for Basque industry related to transport material. There's quite a big train manufacturing, airplane manufacturing activity in the Basque Country, and to metal, rubber, and plastics industries. These were other industries that were significantly at risk and affected during the pandemic. So that probably was the most significant part from the kind of more industrial competitiveness perspective of the Basque Country. We then, as I said, we interviewed a lot of firms about their responses, and the overwhelming response was this kind of notion of an express digital transition. The idea that firms were fast tracking things that they'd had in mind to be working on over the next 5-10 years. They were suddenly having to do them in 2-3 months in terms of really fast tracking their digital transformation. Sometimes in terms of product and streamline and bringing to the market more quickly new products, other times in terms of process, and perhaps most radically in terms of the channel of distribution, where we've seen, again, this is not specific to the Basque Country. I'm sure you've seen this in Ireland very clearly as well in terms of business responses, this kind of express digital transformation. And the third area we looked at was the policy responses. There we found that in general, regional responses tend to complement the policies led by national governments. I think it's very normal in the context of such a pandemic that it's national governments or member states that lead the way with policy responses. But regions have also played a significant role. And we undertook a comparative analysis, as I said, of the Basque Country, Baden-Württemberg and Upper Austria, who all have fairly similar industrial structures, hence choosing those two benchmarks. And we saw that, above all, the types of policies implemented in those three regions had been very similar. So there was a lot of similarity across the different measures, and they were principally oriented towards sustaining liquidity of companies, supporting that digitalization. So there was a big focus in all three regions on how do we help firms undertake this fast express digitalization. Also, to a lesser extent, in these regions, there was a focus on supporting R&D projects that respond to the pandemic challenges. So providing subsidies and money to projects that responded to specific challenges related to the pandemic. And of course, attempts to support the most affected sectors. But that's obviously a very difficult thing to do given the uncertainty associated with the pandemic and the differential effects it can have across sectors. So that's just a little bit of insight on what we got to in terms of the resisting or during the pandemic. The report then turns to the future, and we identified 7 keys to building long-term resilience, which again, as I said, they came from analysis within this report, both of the benchmarking of the Basque Country and of what was happening during the pandemic, but also a range of other research with different stakeholders around different aspects of competitiveness. And we argued that there are, if you like, 3 core keys to building long-term resilience, which can be found in understanding digitalization as a transversal lever for resilience, sustainability as an opportunity, and the foundational economy, those parts of the economy that perhaps have really had the light shone on them during the pandemic, the key workers and the parts of the economy related to food, related to health, related to education, which have been so important and perhaps in the past have been neglected, an argument that these parts of the economy can actually be a source of competitiveness, and we can work on those as a source of competitiveness. So those 3, if you like, core responses to building long-term resilience rely in turn on a series of other conditions. First of all, we identified skills or the capacities of the people within the region as being particularly important. And I mean, the Basque Country is a highly skilled region. It actually has the highest overqualification index in Europe at regional level. So it's you could argue that it's too qualified. But perhaps what's lacking in our system is more agility and the ability to hone and tailor those skills needs to the needs of industry. So we're arguing that actually, in order to respond effectively to digitalization, sustainability, and building a foundational economy, we need a more agile and responsive skills ecosystem. And then there are a series of 3 more key points related more to the how and how we actually go about doing this. We argued that public leadership is very important. We need to harness the public sector, again, a very important sector within the Basque Country. We need to harness that towards new solutions, innovations and infrastructure, but we need to do that in collaboration with the private sector, so strong public-private collaboration. And in particular, we argued that that involves taking the smart specialization strategies that have been developed in the Basque Country over the last 7 or 8 years. We need to take them to a new level, and in particular, we need to make them more sustainable. So we need to I think the smart specialization strategy of the Basque Country is a topic for another talk, but it's often held up as a good example of how a region has strategically taken on board competitiveness and economic development. And what we argue is that we need to take that forward further, and in particular, make it more sustainable through that public-private collaboration. And finally, develop more sophisticated forms of co-governance, and that means governance at multiple levels, the interaction between the regional level and the national level, or the regional level and the local level, or the regional level and the European level, and also multi-actor governance mechanisms. And that's a kind of a constant work in progress, again, not only in the Basque Country, but in pretty much every region. So to kind of bring this discussion a little bit towards the cluster interest of some of the participants today, one of the key conclusions that we reached, particularly when talking about public-private collaboration or about skills, was that clusters in the Basque Country and elsewhere play a key intermediary role. And indeed, if we are arguing that digitalization, sustainability, and the foundational economy are, if you like, the core characteristics of building long-term resilience, then clusters need to be harnessing the power of collaboration that they offer to those three challenges. And I wanted to kind of delve a little bit deeper there by introducing some work that we've been doing this year in the framework of the European Cluster Collaboration Platform, which is which many of you are probably aware is a platform that is managed by DG GROW, the European Commission, to bring together clusters across Europe. We are part of the consortium that's currently working on that platform, and part of our work this year has been developing discussion papers that focus on the role that clusters can play in different aspects. So, for example, the first discussion paper we did earlier on this year was on the role that clusters can play in supporting skills for industry, in particular that point on an agile skills ecosystem. And there, if we think about the types of mismatches that we find in regional economies when related to skills, where supply of skills doesn't coincide with demand, particularly that's relevant for digitalization. We see very clearly in the Basque Country that firms are missing certain digital skills. And those mismatches are very much activity and place specific. They're activity specific because they depend on different, in different industries, the pictures is very different, and they're place specific because regions have different skills supply systems and different industry demand. And that means that essentially clusters being activity and space and place specific provide a very, very useful mechanism for trying to bridge those skill gaps. So we argue that in this discussion paper that because they bring together government, firms, education, research in a place-specific, industry-specific context, cluster collaboration can provide both the critical mass and brokerage that can help to make skills ecosystems more responsive and more agile. And the discussion paper actually sets out a series of actions that cluster organizations can develop, either acting alone or acting in collaboration, nationally or internationally, to try and support a more effective skills ecosystem within their region. So I won't go into details here, but all these details are in the discussion paper with regards to the type of actions that we think clusters can provide. Similarly, the second discussion paper that we developed for the ECCP was related to the role of clusters in supply chain adjustments. And that's was developed already in the context of COVID and responding or attempting to respond to some of the concerns that were particularly prevalent in the first wave of the COVID pandemic. And I think that many of this analysis can also be applied to Brexit and to the types of things that are going to be impacting supply chains, or already are impacting supply chains in the Brexit context. There we argued that firms themselves go through a process of reflection around their supply chains when a disruption like COVID takes place. So you start from a status quo, you've then got a shock, COVID or Brexit. The first response is usually to hold out. So to try and resist, to see, well, what can we, we can't change anything radically. So what can we do to cope with that shock and the overall situation? But as the shock persists, then firms start to evaluate. They start to think, well, are there things we can do differently? What are the current weaknesses and liabilities? Diagnosis about whether the disruption may occur again, or if it's a one-off. And from that evaluation, they will tend to either reinforce, so develop measures to try and reinforce their current supply chains and reduce the risk within their current supply chains, or, and they will try to reconceive, to re-engineer, redesign, reorient supply chains, which may, for example, there's been a lot of discussion around backshoring and localizing supply chains as a response to this. So this is an attempt to kind of depict the business decision-making process when it comes to supply chain disruption. And again, we argue and we take examples in the discussion paper from around Europe of where clusters are playing a role in each of those phases. So for example, in the hold-out phase in the Basque Country, one of the first things that the cluster organizations did was to work together collectively to set up a central purchasing center for buying and delivery of protection equipment and other key inputs for certain elements of the Basque industry. Cluster Excellence Denmark, in terms of the kind of evaluate phase, have produced a really interesting discussion paper in which they argue that standard cluster tools like matchmaking, research partnerships, etc., can actually be used very much to help firms to evaluate what's happening with their supply chains. And as you move into reinforce and reconceive, again, Basque example, we've been working with clusters in the Basque Country through SPRI, the Basque Business Development Agency, to help them develop what we call cluster reactivation roadmaps. So trying to think, well, what do they as cluster organizations need to do differently to support their members in the context of the crisis, in particular around supply chains. And at the European level, the European Commission and the European Cluster Alliance has done, again, you may be aware of the regular, daily meetings taking place, but through the European Cluster Alliance, to try and identify and provide relief to the disrupted supply chains over the last 6 months. So again, another example of cluster actions. And just to conclude, therefore, and a couple of minutes longer than 20, so apologies for that, but I guess the main point is that resilience is not a question of returning to the status quo. It's actually about leveraging existing competitiveness strengths and engaging with present circumstances and future trends to continually transform and to be strategic about that continual transformation. In that sense, while the pandemic is hugely disruptive, we should be aware of that it's actually taking place in the context of other ongoing structural changes to regional economies that predate COVID and will also post-date COVID. So the green transition, digital transition, socio-democratic transition, Brexit, these are all things that also have very important implications and that require that continuous approach to resilience. Cooperation itself is essential in that context. It's very powerful in navigating those transitions. And in that sense, clusters and cluster organizations are ideally placed to play a very influential role and powerful role in fostering the cooperation that's needed to navigate those transitions. And if you're interested in either the Basque Country Competitiveness Report or the ECCP discussion papers, you have there the web addresses where they can be downloaded, along with various other resources related to this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, James, for that presentation, for all those insights and for sharing. There's a wealth of information and learning for us in there. I'd like to invite Owen and